So our topic tonight is the person of Jesus. So after the tour of the church last time we met, before that time, we were looking at the mystery of God and the encounter that God had with, or Moses had with God, a significant point of revelation. But tonight we're going to focus in, and we have 2 evenings on the person of Jesus. So this evening we begin, and I think that the person of Jesus is central to being Christian. The very name Christian comes from Christ, and the word Christ means anointed. In the Old Testament, Messiah, Mashiach, means anointed with oil, chosen by God for some particular role. Kings were anointed in the Old Testament with oil, like King David had oil poured over his head. Prophets were symbolically anointed, and also priests were anointed. So when God chose someone for a particular purpose and set them apart, they were called anointed or Messiah or Christ. And Christ means the anointed one. So we'll come back to that later. But first thing I want to say about the person of Jesus is, we are inheritors of a 2,000-year living community of faith that has worshipped the Lord Jesus and given praise and thanks to Him for the last 2 millennia. So we are a body of believers who have handed on an ancient faith in the person of Jesus. Now, a couple of centuries ago, or a little further back, after the age of the Enlightenment, when modern history began to develop and modern historical methods to study ancient history, they eventually, believe it or not, around the 1700s, began to apply those methods to the study of the person of Jesus. So the first thing was called, there was a quest to discover the historical Jesus. And the idea behind it was that the Christ of faith that we worship in the Christian churches has been so shaped by 2,000 years of our faith tradition. What was the living person of Jesus like before Christianity developed? So that was sort of the question. How do we look back before the beginnings of Christianity to discover that first century Jewish rabbi, if you want to put it that way? So it's interesting. The original quest to discover the answer to that question, someone compared it to looking down the well of time. And when you look down a well, if you're standing over a well, and you look down to the bottom of the well through the time of history, what do you see reflected back? Your own face, yes. So those who were looking for Jesus often had an idea about who He was, and so they would look back into the Gospels and find a portrait that already reflected what they believed about Jesus. You all may know that even someone as famous as Thomas Jefferson did sort of an amended set of Gospels where he chose parts of the Gospels about Jesus that he liked, mainly the ethical teaching and the miraculous kind of things he sort of blacked out. So a selective reading of the life of Jesus. So I will say this, there's a priest that died not long ago by the name of John Meyer. And his project, this is sort of more recent, in the last few decades, he did ask the question, he said, if you put 4 scholars together, I think he said in the Harvard Library Law School basement, and sequestered them and studied all the documents that we know about Jesus. And one of them was an atheist, one was a Catholic or Christian, one was a Protestant, one was a Jew. what could all four of them agree on about the facts about the person of Jesus, purely from a historical point of view, quite apart from faith. And so that was his project. Volume 1, A Marginal Jew, is this thick, explains his historical methodology. And if you're looking for a portrait of the Jesus of history, you can't find a better volume than John Myers, and even his series of books. Pope Benedict wrote a book about Jesus of Nazareth, and in the footnotes, at one place, he said that John Meyer, he basically sort of gave him a compliment in saying, really, he does the best in this area that you can do. It shows both the value of and the limits of the historical approach to Jesus. So, and obviously we're going to move beyond the Jesus of history, but I think it's worth asking the question, you know, it's important to remember that Jesus himself was an historical figure. And when you read through those series of volumes that John Meyer has written, and you ask the question, what can we know about Jesus quite apart from faith? The answer is actually quite a lot. So, you know, there's a lot that can be known about Jesus of Nazareth that has nothing to do with faith, but faith certainly has given us a new insight into the person of Jesus. And I bring that up tonight because I think it's important that all of us, in a sense, try to approach the person of Jesus with fresh eyes. You know, sometimes we have been, it's like when you've been in your house for many years and you've had beautiful paintings on the walls. You know, after you've been there a while, you don't see them anymore, do you? You walk by them every day and you don't even notice them anymore. They become too familiar. And Jan Lambrecht, a Jesuit in Belgium, wrote a book on the parables of Jesus, and the title was called Once More Astonished. And his point in studying the parables of Jesus was when Jesus first told parables in his own historical setting, most of the parables would have been shocking. So there's something about the story that invites the listener in. Once you're into the story, the whole world gets turned upside down. And so he said, but we've heard the parables so many times for 2,000 years that we hear the beginning of the parable, and we're like, oh yeah, I've heard that one before. We're no longer astonished. So he said, we have to be astonished again at the newness that Jesus brought. So for a moment, I want you to imagine that you're alive 2,000 years ago, and you happen to be in the area of the Sea of Galilee, and you're a villager living in one of those Jewish villages along the shores of the northwestern part of the Sea of Galilee. And this fellow shows up in your synagogue from Nazareth and begins to, not trained as a rabbi formally, begins to preach in the synagogue, something you've never heard before. So what would you think? You know, well, we can sort of imagine today if somebody showed up at St. Henry on Sunday and walked up to the podium and said, oh, I have some thoughts I want to share about the gospel today, and began to speak about entirely new things with authority, with no training or background that we have had. How would we respond to such a figure? You know, how would we represent Jesus? So it's important to remember that because Jesus himself encountered a lot of different responses in the first century. So most scholars will date the life of Jesus' birth around 4 to 6 BC. Why is that? Why would Jesus be born before Christ? When they did the calendar, they were a little bit off. So somewhere 4 to 6 years before BC, the birth of Jesus occurred. He lived roughly, the traditional date is 33 years, somewhere between 30, 35 years old. Would have died somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 AD by crucifixion. There are references to Jesus outside of Christianity, and certainly figures like Pontius Pilate were historical figures known to ancient historians, John the Baptist, Herod, the Tetrarch. So these are, the Gospels contain numerous references to widely known historical figures at the time. So that roots Jesus in the history of first century Israel. And so for roughly 40 years, from around 30 AD when the death and resurrection occurred, till about 70, most historical scholars who study the formation of Gospels closely from a historical point of view, that's sort of a window of time, a couple of generations, that the good news about Jesus, the stories about his life, death, and resurrection are being handed down by word of mouth predominantly. So why do you think Christians were mostly handing things down by word of mouth at the beginning? And what do you think? Yes, I saw you kind of thinking about it. No working press, that's true. All those documents had to be handwritten, it's true.
Fear of persecution.
Fear of persecution might have been
If they had something
part of
written.
it, but it's something more. When you read the New Testament, you get a sense of it. Yes, there was a great urgency. The day of the Lord will happen, Paul said, like a thief in the night. So there was a sense that Jesus is going to return really quickly, and you better be ready. So what they were doing was they were going all throughout the Roman Empire with great eagerness, spreading the good news about Jesus by word of mouth. Important to tell the good news to all the world. And probably the number one foremost preacher of Jesus, risen from the dead, crucified and risen, was Paul the Apostle. So he went all throughout the Roman Empire. He was a Roman citizen. He was an educated rabbi, very brilliant. He was converted to Jesus by a direct encounter with the risen Lord on the road to Damascus that transformed his life. And once he was transformed, he couldn't keep his mouth shut. He had to go everywhere. And Paul, began to go to, and at that point, the Jewish faith was spread throughout the Roman Empire. So there were Jewish synagogues all throughout the Roman Empire in the major cities. And the road system was very good in the Roman Empire. Transportation was easy. The peace of the Roman Empire allowed Christianity actually to spread very quickly. So Paul would travel to Roman cities, visit the synagogue. He would begin to tell the good news about Jesus. And he discovered that sometimes the Jewish members of the synagogue did respond, but sometimes they responded negatively. And so he began to tell the good news to non-Jews, to people outside that inner circle. And so Gentiles began to hear the gospel because of Paul and others. And they too believed. So this was a pivotal moment in the life of the church, these 40 years. So what would have happened around 70 AD? Some significant things occur in the 60s.
Temple destruction.
All right, so Rome comes into Jerusalem and destroys the city of Jerusalem, levels the temple. So the destruction of the city of Jerusalem takes place. The city of Jerusalem is put into ruins, and by that point, Christians were throughout the Roman Empire. They'd already begun to spread rapidly, even in the city of Rome. The other thing that happened was in 64, there was a fire, major fire in the city of Rome. The Emperor Nero at the time blamed, when you're a politician and something destructive happens, you need someone to blame for it. So Nero blamed the Christians, that new community in Rome were the ones who must have started the fire. They were responsible. So the first persecution in the city of Rome occurred during the mid-60s, and among those put to death were both Peter and Paul. So the two great apostles who brought the gospel, among others, to the city of Rome were martyred in the mid-60s. So why then would a gospel be written around 70? Most scholars are dating Mark roughly 70. Well, generation one, the first eyewitnesses, the first preachers of the gospel are beginning to die. Jesus has not returned yet. This needs to be put into writing. So I'm with the great majority of historical scholars that study the gospel history and think that Mark is the first of the four to be written. And it is elegantly simple. It's the gospel. It's the shortest of the four. You can read it in one sitting. So in fact, that's what I want to encourage all of you to do. So sometime between now and next week, it doesn't take that long, just sit down and read through the Gospel of Mark. First glimpse. There's something in Mark's Gospel that is very urgent. You know, the Greek word and keeps showing up, and then this happened, and then Jesus did this, and then that happened, and then that happened. Some have called the Gospel of Mark a passion narrative with an extended introduction. So that is one of the ways that Mark's Gospel has been described. But I like it because it's the least refined of the four, so you get something of that freshness of what it might have been like to meet Jesus for the first time and to have to make a decision. Who do I think this man is? So hopefully all of you brought Bibles tonight. Everybody have a Bible to look at. I said we're going to use them a lot, so if you have a Bible, grab it. We're going to go to the Gospel of Mark this evening. And we're going to go right into the center of the Gospel, or what I call the hinge of Mark's Gospel, and that is in chapter 8. Let's go to verse 27 and following. Chapter 8 in the Gospel of Mark, verse 27.
Chapter 8, verse 27?
Correct. And then Jesus, this is a slightly older translation. This is the St. Joseph edition of the New American Bible. It's bigger print so I can read it. Then Jesus and his disciples set out for the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked his disciples this question: "Who do people say that I am?" They replied, "Some, John the Baptizer." Why would they think Jesus was John the Baptizer? John had been beheaded by Herod, so the martyrdom of John had taken place. Others, Elijah. Why would they think Elijah? Elijah, at the end of his life on earth, was the prophet taken up in a chariot in the Old Testament, and there was a widespread Jewish belief that Elijah would return before the Messiah appeared. So, and every year at the Seder, the Jewish Passover celebration, there's a place left for Elijah the prophet at table. So some were saying Jesus was Elijah returned, the prophet Elijah returned. Still others, one of the prophets. And you, he went on to ask them, who do you say that I am? So this question is of principal importance. When you read the Gospel of Mark, 90% of the ministry of Jesus over that 1 to 3 year window of time, he has a public ministry. Mark's Gospel, Matthew and Luke, it could be 1 year. John has a 3-year kind of format in his Gospel. John's Gospel is somewhat different than Matthew and Luke and Mark. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke look more similar. That's why they're called synoptic. It's a word that means to look alike. We'll discover why that is so. The question of Jesus in this gospel is, who do you say that I am? I think that the Gospel of Mark was written to answer two basic questions. One, who is this Jesus of Nazareth? And the second question, what does it mean to follow him? So those are the two basic questions that Mark will answer in the telling of the gospel. So right here in the center, and Jesus spent most of his ministry and the synoptics right around the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, very walkable area. The center was a village called Capernaum, which is right on the edge of the water. When you go there, the foundations of the first century homes are still visible. They've excavated down the first century. And there was one structure that's by graffiti and ancient Christian tradition identified as the House of Simon Peter. And over that now has been built a 20th century church suspended above that dwelling place. And you see foundations going back to a 4th century synagogue that they believe were built on the site of the 1st century synagogue there in Capernaum. So there you are standing on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. That was the center of Jesus' ministry. So that's where he met the 4 fishermen, Simon, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. That's where he would say in the Gospels, he would go back to the house. That's the house of Simon Peter, where he healed the mother-in-law of Peter. So Peter's wife's mom was healed by Jesus in that home. And that's where Jesus begins his public ministry, the synagogue there in Capernaum, and that's where he begins to proclaim the good news. So most of his ministry is there. Where is Caesarea Philippi? Well, it's way up north. You follow the river that flows down into the Sea of Galilee, which is really a freshwater lake. You follow the north part, the river back up to the origins. Caesarea Philippi was the spring at the base of a huge mountain, Mount Hermon, and the water from the melting snow would come down and form fresh springs, and that would flow down to the Sea of Galilee. And there was a shrine to Caesar there. That's why it was called Caesarea Philippi, to Philip. And so it was a pagan shrine dedicated to, the Romans had set it apart, non-Jewish. And so they're going about as far away as Jesus will get in recorded events away from Jerusalem when Jesus asked the question. And when they get there, if you go there today, this freshwater spring there is beautiful. There's a huge cliff behind it of solid rock. So the story will unfold that way. But the question is, who do you say that I am? And so they're giving him all the answers that everybody gave. How did people respond to Jesus? Some responded and were willing to leave everything behind to follow him. Think about Peter, Andrew, James, and John. They were fishermen. And Jesus asked them to leave their work behind, their livelihood, their families. Something about Jesus was so magnetic, they all said yes, and they followed him. They left behind their families. Now they were in the area. They left behind their work, and they became disciples of Jesus. They followed him. You'll also see very quickly in the Gospel of Mark that other people were highly offended. We're going to have to kill this guy. He's a fraud. So reactions to Jesus were all the way across the spectrum, from I'll give up everything for you to I'm going to kill you. So that's the kind of reaction that Jesus engendered. So that's why he's asking, tell me, what are they saying about me out there? But then the important question is, but what about you? Who do you say that I am? Now listen to Simon Peter here. Peter answered him, you are, what does your version say? It says you are the Messiah, or you are the Christ. You are the anointed one. So that means the one anointed, chosen by God. And what would that mean? What do you think Peter meant by that? You're the anointed one. Well, God's people living around the Sea of Galilee, all throughout the people of Israel, were living in occupation, as they had been for many years. They were under the authority of the Roman Empire. They were dreaming of the day when God would raise up a new king. You notice in the gospel, some people will say, Son of David, right? We want somebody like David, a king that will set us free from the slavery of the Romans. The Greeks invaded in 333 BC. They had a period of rebellion when they had some successful autonomy for a short window of time under the Maccabees. But then the Romans arrived in 64 BC, And the Romans were incredibly good administrators, good road builders, and they tolerated the Jewish faith as long as the Jews didn't buck the system, the imperial system. So, and they also taxed them heavily. So they were taxed, they were occupied. So when Simon Peter is saying to Jesus, "You are the anointed one," he probably is trying to say about Jesus, "You're the king. You're the one who's going to set us free from the Romans." Then Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone about him. Why do you think he was like, "Be quiet about this"? What happens to people who claim they're going to take over the government? The existing government doesn't like that very well. They kill you. So, let's be quiet about this. And then Jesus began to teach them that, notice he speaks now about himself, that the Son of Man, the human one, the Son of Man had to suffer much, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, be put to death, and rise 3 days later. First time in the gospel that Jesus announces to those who are following him what's going to happen. I'm going to die. I'm going to be rejected, put to death, and on the third day rise. And I want to say something about the Gospels that we have today, because they're written 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, roughly or so. They're written with resurrection glasses. They already know the end of the story. They know the whole picture by the time they're writing it. So they're not trying to write an historical timeline about Jesus. They have an intentionality about them. They're sharing faith in Jesus. That's the purpose for which the Gospels are written. So it's interesting. Now, what's the response of Peter to this announcement? He said these things quite openly. Peter then took him aside and began to rebuke him. At this, he turned around and eyeing the disciples, reprimanded Peter. "Get out of my sight, or get behind me, you Satan." The word Satan is the word tempter. You are not judging by God's standards, but by human standards. So, whatever Peter meant by "you are the anointed one," when Jesus began to explain what that meant, that is not what Peter had signed up for. No. His idea was, kingship, victory, not being put to death and crucified. So, and then Jesus summoned the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If a man wishes to come after me, he must deny his very self, take up his cross, and follow in my steps." So now he's announcing, not only does it mean that the Son of Man is going to go to Jerusalem and die, but if you want to follow me, you also have to be shaped by that same pattern of being willing to carry your cross and suffer and die. Now, it's interesting. Jesus will have to tell them this a second time. So if you go to the next chapter, go to chapter 9, verse 30. They left that district and began a journey through Galilee, but he did not want anyone to know about it. He was teaching his disciples in this vein: "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men who will put him to death. 3 days after his death, he will rise." But they failed to understand his words. They were afraid to question him. So Peter tries to say, "Don't do it. Don't go." Jesus says, "Get behind me, you tempter." In other words, get behind me and follow me to Jerusalem. Now, the second time Jesus predicts it, what's the very next thing that happens? Jesus notices that the disciples, what are they talking about after he's announced that he's going to die for the second time? Well, look at the very next story. They're arguing about which one of them is most important. Right? I'm going to go die. Okay, now they're talking to each other. Which one of us is most important? Isn't it interesting? And then he sat down and called the 12 around him and said, "If anyone wishes to rank first, he must remain the last one of all and the servant of all. So they misunderstand greatness, what it means to follow him, what it means to be in his company. It's not about who is most important, but who is the servant of all. The Son of Man, he says, came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. So a second time he tells the apostles, this is what it's about. Now, if you go over to the next chapter, chapter 10, you get a third prediction in verse 32. The disciples were on the road going up to Jerusalem. Now they're on their way to Jerusalem, with Jesus walking in the lead. Their mood was one of wonderment. They're all excited to be going to Jerusalem. While that of those who followed was fear. So there's some followers of Jesus, not the 12, who are more aware of what's going on. They're afraid. Taking the 12 aside, once more he began to tell them what was going to happen to him. And notice it gets more detailed. We are on our way up to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes that will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit at him, flog him, and finally kill him. But 3 days later, he will rise. Now, third prediction. Do the apostles get it yet? Next story, we know what happens. James and John have a special request for Jesus. When we get to Jerusalem, hey, can we sit at your right and left on either side of your throne? And Jesus says, you don't get it, do you? Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? Are you going to be baptized with the baptism I'm going to be baptized? Oh yeah, we can. They don't get it. But he says, yes, that's going to happen. It will happen to you. And they will both be martyred. I don't know about John, but James will. And so then the other 10 are angry. They're indignant that James and John are asking for special seats of honor. And then Jesus has to remind them, you know, among the Gentiles, great people make their importance felt. It cannot be like that among you. And that's where we get the clear reference to the Son of Man came to give his life as a ransom for many. So 3 different moments in time when Jesus explains to the apostles, the Son of Man is going to Jerusalem to die, and each time they're not ready to accept it. Now it's very interesting. After all 3 of those predictions, there is a very important story, and the story is the story of Bartimaeus, the blind man. Now let's go back again to chapter 8, verse 27, where we got the first question, who do you say the Son of Man is? What does it mean to follow Jesus? What healing takes place right before he asked the question? You notice who gets healed? A blind man. Oh yeah, look at this story in chapter 8:22, right before he asked the question. When they arrived at Bethsaida, some people brought him a blind man. So notice the blind man doesn't come to Jesus asking for help, but people bring the blind man to Jesus. And they begged him to touch him. Jesus took the blind man's hand and led him outside the village. Putting spittle on his eyes, he laid his hands on him and asked, "Can you see anything?" The man opened his eyes and said, "I see people, but they look like walking trees." Then a second time Jesus laid his hands on his eyes and he saw perfectly. His sight was restored and he could see everything clearly. Jesus sent him home with the admonition, do not even go into the village. Do you remember another miracle in the Gospels where Jesus he has some hard time healing the person? First time he tries, still he can see, but it's still foggy. That blind man didn't see Jesus out. He was brought to Jesus. So he doesn't ask to see, but Jesus begins to heal his eyes. But he doesn't really see very clearly yet. And then when he does finally get to see, he goes home. Now let's go back to Bartimaeus. So 2 stories about blind men around those 3 predictions of the dying of Jesus. They came to, so that's chapter 10, verse 46, they came to Jericho, which is right down there in the desert. The road goes from Jericho straight up the mountain to Jerusalem. So now getting close to the place of the Passion. And as he was leaving that place with his disciples and a sizable crowd, there was a blind beggar, Bartimaeus. So we got a name. This blind man gets a name. The son of Timaeus, sitting by the roadside. On hearing that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to call out, Jesus, Son of David. Notice the king reference. Have mercy on me, or have pity on me. Many people were scolding him to make him keep quiet, but he shouted all the louder, Son of David, have mercy on me. Then Jesus stopped and said, call him over. When Jesus calls someone in the Gospel of Mark, or Matthew or Luke, it means they're going to be a disciple. Anyone called is a disciple. So Jesus calls him over, so they call the blind man over, telling him as they did so, you have nothing to fear from him. Get up, he's calling you. He threw aside his cloak, jumped up, and came to Jesus. He wants to be healed, doesn't he? Very different than the first blind man. Jesus asked him, what do you want me to do for you? Rabboni, the blind man said, I want to see. I want to see. Jesus said in reply, be on your way, your faith has healed you. Immediately he received his sight and started to follow Jesus up the road. One who was called by Jesus and follows him is a disciple. He follows Jesus up the road. And where are they going to go? Up to Jerusalem, where Jesus will be crucified. So many scholars say that the Gospel of Mark is constructed to teach a theology about the person of Jesus. I think it's a masterpiece of narrative construction. So you have a blind man. Well, who does the blind man represent? Who does Bartimaeus represent? Who can't see yet who Jesus really is, but needs to see it? It's the 12, right? They're the blind ones. They can't see who Jesus really is yet. Jesus is trying to tell them. So at the beginning, they're progressively, they see a little bit, but they don't really get clear vision, like the first blind man. By the end, they're requesting, I want to see. I want to see. They need to have the right eyes to see who Jesus really is. So in the Gospel of Mark, what is the most important title for Jesus? It's not Messiah, it's not the Christ, like Peter said. It's a more important identity of the person of Jesus in Mark's Gospel.
Son of David?
Not Son of David either. That's a good guess. The healer, he is a healer in the Gospel of Mark. He heals all the parts of the human body in Mark's Gospel. But the most important title given to Jesus in the entire Gospel of Mark is Jesus is the Son of God. Son of God. How would we know that? Well, let's go back to chapter 1, verse 1 in Mark's Gospel. So there were no titles, by the way. It didn't even say the Gospel according to Mark in the ancient Greek text. It just starts with the Greek words of the Gospel. The first words of the Gospel of Mark, here begins the Gospel, Evangelion, the good news of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One. And does your text have the Son of God? That's the title. Does yours have brackets around Son of God? Yeah. The reason it has brackets around it, some ancient manuscripts don't have the title Son of God there in the text. Some do, and that's why it's added in brackets. So if you're a biblical historical scholar, that's a a good sleuth question. Was the original, did it include it and then somebody later omitted it? Or did someone later decide we should add that at this point? Well, if it's the most important title for who Jesus is, I wouldn't leave it out, would you? So probably it was added with a recognition, this matters. We've got to include this in the title. That's why some ancient manuscripts have it and some don't. And why do I think it's the most important title? Well, let's go down into chapter 1 to verse 9. During that time, this is the first time we meet Jesus in Mark's Gospel. Jesus came from Nazareth to Galilee and was baptized in the Jordan by John. Immediately on coming up out of the water, Jesus saw the sky rent in two and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. Then a voice came from the heavens, "You are my beloved Son. On you my favor rests." What will we call this episode of Jesus' baptism? In the Old Testament, they call this a theophany. God is speaking. God reveals something important. What do we hear God the Father reveal? When the heavens open up and the Spirit descends like a dove, this is a way of saying biblically, major announcement is about to take place. Pay attention. This is really important. And the important announcement is, you're my beloved Son. I'm well pleased with you. So the identity of Jesus as the beloved Son of the Father is the most important revelation the Father wants to give at this pivotal moment. Now, there's also, we go further into the Gospel, back to Caesarea Philippi. Let's go back to chapter 8, verse 27. After Jesus has revealed that the Son of Man is going to be crucified, in chapter 9, verse 2, 6 days later, after he's revealed the first prediction of their passion, 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John off by themselves with him and led them up a high mountain. He was transfigured before their eyes, and his clothes became dazzlingly white, whiter than the work of any bleacher could make them. Elijah appeared to them along with Moses. The two were in conversation with Jesus. Moses, Elijah, they represent the whole Old Testament, law and prophets. This is another theophany. It's a moment when God is going to reveal something very important. Then Peter spoke to Jesus, "Rabbi, how good it is for us to be here. Let us erect 3 booths on this side, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He hardly knew what to say, for they were all overcome with awe. A cloud came overshadowing them, and out of the cloud a voice, "This is my Son, my beloved. Listen to him." So the second time, the first time in Mark's Gospel, the Father speaks directly to the Son. This time, it's an announcement to Peter, James, and John, the 3 closest apostles. "This is my Son. Listen to him." There's more to meet the eye here than you've known yet. So the demons, by the way, they know who Jesus is. So possessed people will come running up to Jesus. "You are the Son. We know who you are. You're the Holy One of God. We know it." And Jesus silences them. Be quiet. Come out of him. So the enemy knows the identity of Jesus. Who is the first human being in the Gospel of Mark that correctly identifies who Jesus is, a Son of God? Yeah, the Roman centurion. Let's go to the end of Mark's Gospel, chapter 14. Actually 15, and we'll go to verse 33. When noon came, darkness fell on the whole countryside and lasted until mid-afternoon. At that time Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? In Mark's Gospel, it's the only thing Jesus says as he's dying on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken or abandoned me? It's the beginning of a psalm, by the way. He's quoting a psalm from the Old Testament, which ends in trust in God. But it begins with this God-forsaken cry. My God, why have you abandoned me? A few of the bystanders who heard it remarked, listen, he's calling on Elijah. Someone ran off and soaked a sponge in sour wine, stuck it on a reed to try to make him drink. The man said, now let's see whether Elijah comes to take him down. Then Jesus, uttering a loud cry, breathed his last. At that moment, the curtain in the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom. What is that curtain? It's in the temple in Jerusalem, in the Holy of Holies, the holiest place, that sacred place. The veil that separates it from the outside is torn in half. When someone died when you were in the first century as a Jew that you loved, you would tear your clothing. You know, this is to me a theologically powerful statement. The Father's response to the death of the Son is the rending of the temple curtain. The centurion, the Roman soldier who is at the cross at that point, who stood guard over him, on seeing the manner of his death, declared, clearly this man was the Son of God. First human being in the whole Gospel of Mark that correctly identifies the most important depth of who Jesus really is. And it's the Roman centurion, not one of the 12. By the way, where are all the male disciples in Mark's Gospel at the crucifixion? They all ran off. Yeah. So in Mark's Gospel, it's only the women who are there from a distance watching what's happening. You'll see that next. There were also some women present looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and Joses and Salome. These women had followed Jesus when he was in Galilee and attended to his needs. There were also many others who had come up with him to Jerusalem. So Jesus, unlike most first century rabbis, had women followers who accompanied him on the journey. So I think Mark's Gospel is theologically important. The centurion sees the death of Jesus and then makes that great proclamation of faith. This was the Son of God. So Jesus had told them all throughout the Gospel, I'm going to be crucified. Oh, God forbid, I'm going to be crucified. Which one of us is most important? I'm going to be crucified. Can we sit at your right hand and left hand? You know, and now he does die on the cross. I believe Mark intentionally structured his narrative to make the point that we don't really understand who Jesus is as Son of God without understanding that it's connected to the cross itself. It's only in the moment when he gives himself fully for us on the cross that we can really understand the identity of who Jesus is as Son of God for us. So it's intimately bound up with the mystery of the cross in Mark's Gospel. So I think that's why Mark saves that most important human identification to that particular moment in the journey. Now, Mark's Gospel also has a weird ending, so much so that in the textual tradition, different sorts of endings have been added on at the end, but the oldest manuscripts end with chapter 16, verse 8. So let's take a peek real quick at chapter 16. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought perfumed oils with which they intended to go and anoint Jesus. So they saw Jesus die on the cross. They saw the place where the body was laid. And they go back after the Sabbath is over to do an anointing of the body before they seal the tomb for a final time. Very early, just after sunrise on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb. They were saying to one another, "Who will roll back the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked, they found that the stone had been rolled back. It was a huge one. On entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting at the right, dressed in a white robe. When was the last time in Mark's gospel there was a man with a white robe, a young man with a white robe? Anybody know where the young man with the white robe last was in Mark's gospel? Yeah, he was in the garden when Jesus was arrested. The gospel says there was a man there wearing a white robe, and when they arrested Jesus, he ran off and left his white garment behind, ran off naked. Well, what do white garments mean for the early Christian community? It's your baptismal identity, it's your robe. So this is Jesus' follower who leaves behind his baptismal garment when Jesus is arrested, just like all the male apostles leave him. So at the resurrection, at the tomb of Jesus, this white young man is wearing his white robe again. Now, other gospels will say it's an angel or two angels, right? But in Mark, it's just a young man. This frightened them thoroughly, but he reassured them, "You need not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, the one who was crucified. He has been raised up. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. Go now and tell his disciples and Peter. He is going ahead of you to Galilee, where you will see him just as he told you." When did Jesus tell them he would see them in Galilee after his death? Anybody know when he told them that? It was at the Last Supper in Mark's Gospel. He's at the table with them. "I'm gonna, this is my body, it's given for you. After I'm raised up, I will go to Galilee and you will see me there." He told them that at the Last Supper in Mark's Gospel. So this young white man, this young man in white robe is repeating what Jesus already told them at the Last Supper. They made their way out and fled from the tomb, bewildered and trembling, and because of their great fear, they said nothing to anyone. The original Greek answer was, they left the tomb and they left because they were much afraid. They left with the word. The women ran away from the tomb, afraid. The end. That's sort of a weird way to end a gospel, isn't it? They've been told to go, carry the good news, and they run away and they're afraid. Why do you think Mark would have ended the gospel that way if that's the original way it ended? We didn't lose the original ending. So, Gospel of Mark, written roughly 70 AD. Remember what I told you? What happened in 64 AD in Rome? Peter and Paul both die for the faith. The early Christian community recognizes the first apostles have just been martyred. What's happened to the Christians in Rome now, do you think? They're much afraid. Wow, Peter and Paul, they've been killed. First generation. Are we going to go tell the good news now? We might get killed too. So maybe, some people say that one of the early church fathers, was it Irenaeus, who says Mark was the interpreter or the secretary of Peter. So if that is so, if Mark's gospel was written by someone connected with Peter, then when he's writing his gospel, it's probably in the area of the city of Rome or Antioch, close by. He is writing to the early Christian community that has just been traumatized by the death of Peter and Paul. So, did the women go tell the apostles he's going to Galilee? Did they go tell the apostles the good news? Yes, yeah, we know they did, right? So the apostles did get the good news from the women. We wouldn't know it from Mark in the beginning, but yes, they told them. So the early Christian community that's probably much afraid, knows that the women had courage and went and told the good news. So Mark probably left the gospel incomplete because he wants the Christian community to finish the gospel by their actions. Go out now and tell the good news. Don't be afraid. So it involves us, the hearers. We're the ones who now have to go and share the good news of Jesus. And some scholars believe that this gospel was written to be used at an annual Good Friday, So the day when the Christian community remembered the death of Jesus. And if that is so, after Peter, Paul get martyred, it's significant in the way that it ends. So I think it's a masterpiece of narrative theology. So it answers the question, who is Jesus? Jesus is, yes, fully human, Son of Man, but also Son of God. What does it mean to be the Son of God? In Mark's Gospel, it means that he dies on the cross for us, and on the third day rises from the dead. By the way, do we have any evidence that Jesus met the apostles in Galilee like he told them he would at the Last Supper? Do we have any resurrection appearances in Galilee? Yes, we do. In the Gospel of John, chapter 21, they go back to fishing. They go back up to the Sea of Galilee and they're fishing, and the risen Lord is on the beach, and he's cooked breakfast for them, and the beloved disciple identifies. It's Jesus. He's the risen one. And Simon Peter jumps out of the boat, runs through the water, and that's a significant resurrection encounter. Some biblical scholars think that after the apostles ran away from Jesus in Jerusalem, they went back to Galilee to go back to fishing, and that was the first encounter with the risen Lord, just as he had told them what happened at the Last Supper, and as the young man said at the tomb. But there are resurrection appearances also in Jerusalem itself, in the upper room. So if they met Jesus the first time on the Sea of Galilee, they headed back to Jerusalem very quickly to encounter the risen Lord there. That's where the dying happened, the resurrection happened, and that's where Christianity will begin to spread from the city of Jerusalem. So I think that I spent quite a lot of time with the Gospel of Mark tonight because I think it's a good introduction to the identity of who Jesus is. I've answered the first question, who is Jesus from Mark's perspective? The second question I said Mark is asking, what does it mean to follow him? And what does it mean to follow Jesus? We have to take up our cross and follow in his footsteps. That's the answer Mark's Gospel will give. Our lives have to become the life of Jesus. We have to give ourselves in self-giving love as Jesus did. That's the theology of Mark's Gospel. I'll say more next week, but those who try to look at the history of how these three synoptic Gospels are related, they believe that Matthew and Luke both had a copy of the Gospel of Mark in front of them when they wrote their Gospels. They also believe, based on when you study the text carefully, that both Matthew and Luke had a second written source that was a collection of teachings of Jesus that do not appear in the Gospel of Mark. And both of them plug those teachings in to Mark's narrative structure. In addition to that, both Matthew and Luke have traditions about Jesus that Mark doesn't have, and they also add those into their Gospels. So those three Gospels, very similar. When you go from Mark to Matthew and Luke, the reverence to Jesus increases. The apostles get more understanding. The respect for Jesus' family is heightened, so that goes over time. The reverence for Jesus increases, respect for him, the intelligence of the apostles, respect for the family of Jesus. To me, it would be hard to imagine it going the other direction, right, in the Christian community, that over time there would be less respect for the identity of Jesus. The disciples become more clueless, and the family of Jesus is less important over time. So that's why I agree with the majority of historical scholars that believe that Mark was first and Matthew and Luke based on Mark's Gospel. John is a gospel of an altogether different stream, and when you read it right away, if you've read the other three, very, very different than the other three, a unique perspective. We'll talk more about that next week. So not one of the three look-alike gospels, totally new kind of reflective perspective on the person of Jesus. All right, questions?
I have a question. So you're saying that the book of Mark was written in about 70 AD, and I don't know, maybe you've already covered this, and I apologize. I would assume that the disciples were roughly the same age as Jesus, more or less at the time. So if it was written in 70 AD, that he would have been elderly at that point. So how did that come about? I mean, like, did he write it through after Jesus' death, and then it was codified later at 70 AD, or, I mean, is that what it would have?
So remember Jesus spoke in Hebrew or Aramaic, primarily was his mother tongue. Gospel of Mark is written in Greek. We don't have any text manuscripts that predate it in Hebrew or Aramaic. So it seems to have been written in Greek. So we're talking about second generation Christians writing based on what they've heard from the original eyewitnesses and preachers of the gospel. And Luke will make that very clear when he writes his gospel. He's gone back and he's looked at everything the original eyewitnesses had to say and the original proclaimers of the word, and he has organized things for Theophilus in a most orderly way. So they're taking these older materials probably that were handed down by the Christian community in Rome, with Peter being, and Paul being, Peter especially a central figure, and committing it to writing. The stories in Mark's gospel, even though I believe Mark has masterfully put together as an evangelist the structure that teaches the theology, the individual stories in Mark's gospel, some scholars have talked about like pearls on a string. Each story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, but they're self-contained stories. They can all be interchanged if they needed to be. So the stories about Jesus are handed along as episodes rather than the sequence in which they occur, probably. And that's not surprising, because even the way our memory works as human beings, we remember episodes from our lives, don't we? When I was probably, I don't know, 9 years old, 8 years old, maybe 7, probably 9, 8. Myself and my 2 brothers were with my grandmother. She was watching us that day on the city square in Lawrenceburg. And we got into a fight, and we began to chase each other around my grandmother's car. And she was yelling at us, trying to get us to stop running around the car. And she was so mad by the time we got back in the car, she drove us to the convent next to the school and said, "You're going to tell the sisters what you did." We were mortified, we were terrified, you know. She rang the doorbell, and the sisters weren't there, thank goodness, so we didn't have to tell them what we had done. But I remember it as vividly, almost as if it happened yesterday. It's a story, a self-contained story in my memory. I don't remember what happened the day before, I don't remember what happened the day after. I hardly remember what happened earlier in the day or later in the day. I remember the event because it was so significant. So most of the stories about Jesus are very significant events that were remembered by someone and got handed down by word of mouth. And Mark is the one who will incorporate them into the narrative, if that makes sense. Although, like Luke and Matthew, they add new things into the gospel, and just like that story about my brothers and my grandmother is so clear in my mind, we as a family tell that story at home, like at Christmas and Thanksgiving, going, "Remember when Grandma, da, da, da," you know, we retell the story every year. So we've been telling the story for years, and my mother makes a comment a few years ago and says, "Yeah, we could never leave y'all with Grandma after that, because she didn't handle the 3 boys altogether." I never heard that before. So I was like, oh, so a new mom had preserved a little tradition that we had forgotten about or didn't know as kids, but that was handed down too from her memory. And now we know it, so it could be, if I were writing a story now, I could add, and after that, we never got to stay with Grandma alone, the 3 of us. So. I also heated up the thermometer, so Grandma would think it was warm enough to go swimming at the pool that day. So not that day, but another day. So yeah. It's funny how you remember. See, so human memory is episodic, isn't it? We remember profound things that happen, and we hand them down. Other questions? All right, I think we have some questions at the table for discussion, so a great discussion.